Little girl knocked. They're selling mama. The mountain man's response shocked everyone. That's what folks whispered from the edge of the canyon to the dust-choked streets of town. A little girl, no older than 6, had wandered down from the pines barefoot and shaking, knocking on the preacher's door with a message that froze his heart. "They're selling mama," she said. No one knew her name. No one knew where she'd come from. But the old mountain man did. They said he hadn't spoken to a soul in 15 winters, that he lived with ghosts, not neighbors. But when he heard what the child had said, he saddled his mule before the sun rose. What drives a man, broken by the past, to fight like a devil for someone he's never met? And what kind of evil tries to sell a mother like cattle? This is the tale of sorrow, grit, and the fire that still burns in a just man's heart. When a child's cry echoes through the timber and a silent man rides out of exile, one question lingers. Who answered the call for mercy? And who turned away too fast? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like this reach far beyond the frontier. If you still believe in justice, family, and standing up for what's right, then you belong here with us. Let me know which state you're watching from and subscribe to help keep these stories alive. Don't forget to like the video so others can find it too. The knock came soft at first, barely more than the wind brushing against the door. It was just past 4 in the morning, and the town of Warm Springs lay quiet under a blanket of low fog. Smoke curled gently from a few chimneys, but most souls still slept, wrapped in dreams or burdens. Reverend Josiah McKinnon stirred in his bed at the second knock, firmer this time, hurried but weak. He rose groggily, wrapped a wool shawl around his shoulders, and padded to the front door of the parsonage. When he opened it, the cold swept in, and so did she. The child stood no higher than his knee. Barefoot, her feet red and cracked from the frozen earth, her thin nightdress stained with mud and torn along one shoulder. A frayed doll dangled from one hand, missing its left eye and stuffed with pine straw. But it was her eyes that halted the preacher's breath, wide and hollow, dark like a winter pond, and carrying a depth no child should know. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no sound came. Josiah knelt, gently placing a steadying hand on her elbow. "Child," he said softly, "what's your name?" She blinked, eyes fluttering like someone waking from a nightmare. Her voice was almost a whisper, brittle with fear. "They're selling mama." Josiah felt something heavy settle in his chest. He didn't press for more. He simply lifted the girl into his arms, she weighed nothing, and brought her inside. The wood stove had barely warmed the parlor, but it was warmer than the world she'd come from. He set her on the sofa, wrapped her in a quilt, and poured water from the kettle. She flinched at the clatter. He moved slower after that. Words spread faster than fire in a dry barn. By sunrise, half the town had heard about the preacher's strange visitor. Clara, who ran the mercantile, said the girl had the devil's silence about her. Old Mr. Sedge from the livery claimed he saw her wandering past the schoolhouse the night before, talking to herself. Mothers kept their children inside. Speculation turned to concern when Josiah visited the sheriff's office just after breakfast. "She said something strange," Josiah told Sheriff Bartle, an aging man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too little justice and too much drink. "She mentioned a place, a farm, said a man with red hands lived there." Bartle grunted, leaning back in his chair. "Sounds like girl's been through something. Could be one of them runaways from down by Bridger's Hollow. You know what folks are like out there." "She said they're selling her mother," Josiah replied, sharper this time. Bartle shrugged, reaching for his coffee. "Ain't exactly a crime to exaggerate. I'll ask around. But I ain't riding out on hearsay and ghost stories." Josiah left, troubled and angry. Far up the mountain beyond the timberline, where the pines thinned into rock and snow, a man stood still as stone beside a frozen creek. Ezra Blackwood had lived in silence longer than some children had been alive. The wind bit at his beard and pushed against the heavy leather of his coat, but he didn't move. He'd heard the echo from town, a voice carried not on air, but through memory. They're selling Mama. He didn't need to know more. A child had walked barefoot through the wild, seeking someone, anyone, to listen, and no one had. Not really. Ezra turned, his boots crunching over the frozen leaves. In his cabin, he dusted off an old saddle, one he hadn't touched since the war. He packed jerky, a canteen, and a rifle wrapped in oilcloth. Then, with a grunt that sounded almost like a prayer, he threw the saddle over the back of his mule, lit the lantern, and started down the ridge. The bear of the ridge was coming down, and he wasn't coming for talk. The lowlands slept heavy under a sky the color of soot, the air thick with the damp rot of old leaves and sour whiskey. Out where the road turned to mud and fence posts leaned like old bones, Jebediah Crowley's farm squatted in a hollow of thorn and pine, as mean and crooked as the man who ran it. The house, if it could be called that, stood on sinking stilts, its boards warped and weather-stained, its windows smeared yellow from inside smoke. No birds sang near the place. Even the wind avoided it. Inside, Jebediah Crowley stood shirtless in the kitchen, scratching the scruff of his chest, a bottle of rye dangling from 2 fingers. His knuckles were stained rust brown, always bruised from something. Men, animals, walls. It didn't matter. He was a man who only knew power when it was clenched in a fist, and today that power was slipping. He took a swig, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and glared at the trap door and the floorboards. "Should have sold her last month," he muttered, his voice thick with liquor and bitterness. "Could have had a good price for the snow set in." Below the floorboards, in the damp blackness of the root cellar, Clara Crowley sat in silence. Her wrists ached from the rope. Her cheek was swollen. Her lips bled when she moved them, but her eyes remained clear. She sat with her knees tucked to her chest, the dirt cool against her back. Somewhere in the dark, water dripped, soft and steady like the ticking of a crooked clock. She had stopped crying 3 days ago. She prayed now in whispers, not for herself, but for the child who had fled through the vent behind the shelves, holding a scrap of her journal pressed to her chest like a map to salvation. Jebediah kicked over a chair and sat down hard. The bottle thunked against the table. Outside, a wagon rolled in. The visitor was expected. A gaunt man with a sour face and eyes like coins stepped down from the bench, brushing snow off his sleeves. "You said you had something worth moving," he called. Jebediah rose, cracking his neck. "I do. Got myself a stubborn woman, but she's got strong arms and better teeth than most. Not broken yet," the man spat. "You said this was clean." "It is," Jebediah lied. "She's mine. Wife by paper. Don't mean nothing now." The visitor stepped onto the porch, squinting past the grime on the windows. "What about the girl?" "Gone off into the woods chasing shadows. Ain't worth the trouble. Once the woman's sold, I'll fetch the girl back, train her up for chores, keep her quiet." The trader looked uneasy. "Word gets out, you're gonna have more than debts chasing you." "No one's coming," Jebediah growled, slamming the bottle down. "Preacher's a coward. Sheriff's got my ledger, and that Ridge devil, he ain't been seen in years." Below, Clara heard every word. She bit her tongue until it bled. She had prayed for miracles. Now she prayed for fire. Jebediah stood, stomping across the floorboards once more. He banged the butt of his rifle on the trap door. "You hear that, Clara? You'll be gone by week's end. Camps downriver pay better than husbands do. Should have been sweeter." She said nothing, only closed her eyes and leaned her head against the dirt wall, imagining Lily's bare feet finding the preacher's steps, imagining someone, anyone, as believing the truth. Upstairs, Jebediah laughed, poured another drink, and raised his voice in a tuneless song. He believed he had won. He believed no one would come. He believed the world had already turned away. He didn't know that a storm was already riding down the mountain, and it carried the weight of a man with nothing left to lose. The road down from Raven's Ridge twisted like a wounded snake, slick with melting snow and shadowed by trees that hadn't seen axe or lantern in decades. A lone figure rode its crooked spine at dawn, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a battered oilskin coat, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low to guard against the rising wind. The mule beneath him plodded steady and sure, like it knew the weight of silence. Ezra Blackwood hadn't ridden this trail in 15 years, not since the fire. Folks still whispered about the night the flames took his wife and daughter. They said the blaze started with a bottle tossed by drunk railroad men who wanted his land. No one was charged. The company paid hush money and left. Ezra buried his family with his own two hands, then vanished into the high woods with nothing but a carving knife, a rifle, and a grief too large for words. Since then, only the wind and the wolves had seen his face. But now there was a child. He'd heard it from the preacher's own mouth, standing outside the chapel in the brittle morning frost. She came barefoot, Ezra. Said they're selling her mama. Said a man with red hands lives in a farm past the hollow. She's 6 years old, maybe 7. No name. No kinfolk. She didn't cry. That's what haunts me. Ezra said nothing at first, just stared down the slope toward the town below. The fog lay thick in the lowland like a shroud. He adjusted the leather strap on his saddlebag and spoke without turning. What'd she look like? The preacher paused. Small, pale, eyes too big for her face. She's carrying a doll that's more patch than cloth. She wouldn't eat. Just asked if anyone had seen a woman with a braid in a yellow dress. Ezra mounted up without another word. The mule snorted. The preacher watched him disappear into the trees like a man chasing ghosts. By the time he reached Warm Springs proper, the sun had crested over the ridgeline, spilling gold over the tin rooftops and whitewashed fences. Church bells rang for morning prayer, but most didn't make it inside. They were too busy watching through lace curtains and cracked shutters as the bear of the ridge came down from exile. Children pointed, mothers hushed them, men straightened their backs but didn't step outside. Ezra rode slow, the weight of stairs falling on him like snow. His face was creased by years of wind and ash. His beard touched his collarbone. His eyes were flint. He tied the mule to the post outside the parsonage and stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under his boots. Josiah opened the door before he could knock. "She's inside," the preacher said simply. Ezra entered without a word. The girl sat on the floor, wrapped in a quilt too large for her small frame, staring at the fire like it might answer a question she was too afraid to ask. The doll lay limp beside her. Ezra knelt slowly, one knee cracking with age. He looked her in the eye. She didn't flinch. She only blinked once. "My name's Ezra," he said. "Ain't much to look at, and I don't talk more than I have to. But I promise you this, little one." He reached out a calloused hand, not close enough to touch, just enough to show it was there. "You'll never be alone again." Her lip trembled. Then with the slow, uncertain grace of a bird trusting a still branch, she reached out and placed her hand in his. Neither of them said another word. They didn't have to. The ride up the ridge was long and silent, the mule steady under their weight as Ezra cradled Lily against his chest, wrapped in a wool blanket. She hadn't spoken since placing her hand in his, and he didn't ask her to. The trail curved through thickets of pine, past narrow streams crusted with ice, and up toward the spine of the mountain where his cabin stood, half hidden among stone and cedar, facing east like it was waiting for the light to come back. Ezra dismounted at the clearing and carried her inside. The door creaked open to reveal a space both rugged and tender. Thick beams held up the roof. A stone hearth glowed faint with the memory of last night's fire. The place smelled of pine smoke, dried herbs, and old leather. On the walls hung hand-carved tools and an empty wooden cradle, long unused but still dusted clean. Ezra set Lily gently on a cot by the fire and ladled warm stew into a tin bowl. He placed it on a stool beside her. She didn't move, just stared at the flames, clutching her doll close to her chest, legs drawn up like a frightened fawn. Ezra didn't press. He moved to the woodpile near the door and began splitting kindling with steady rhythm. The sound echoed in the stillness. Crack, thud, stack. Lily watched him with cautious eyes, tracking each motion like she was measuring the danger in it. A gust of wind brushed against the shutters, and she flinched, pulling the blanket tighter. Ezra paused, wiped sweat from his brow, and continued, slower now. By evening, she hadn't touched the food. Ezra cooked a fresh batch and left it by the fire again. This time, when he wasn't looking, the bowl was empty. The next morning brought frost and blue shadows over the hills. Ezra rose early and checked his old trap line that wound along the ridge. He hadn't used it in months, but hunger was a cruel habit, and he still checked it out of old instinct. Halfway down the line, a soft cry reached his ears, a sound both wild and wounded. In a rusted iron trap near the creek, a small red fox thrashed weakly, its paw caught in the steel jaws. Ezra knelt, careful not to spook it further. Its eyes locked with his, wide and panicked. Blood stained the snow. Just as he reached for the trap's hinge, a small voice broke through the trees behind him. "Please don't hurt it." He turned. Lily stood at the edge of the trees, barefoot again, the blanket trailing in the snow like a fallen flag. Her eyes shone with fear, not for herself, but for the fox. Ezra said nothing. He pressed down on the spring, and the jaws released with a soft click. The fox didn't move at first, stunned, then limped off into the brush. Lily exhaled, her shoulders sagging in relief. That night, as Ezra stirred the stew and added more salt than usual, he noticed something strange near the cabin's edge. Just outside the door, by the place the fox had passed, Lily had placed her doll, propped upright on a stone, facing the trees like a sentinel. She didn't speak about it. Neither did he. But when he looked at her that evening across the firelight, she met his eyes for the first time without flinching. In the silence, something unspoken had begun to form. Not trust, not yet, but the start of it. Like the first green shoot pushing through frost-bitten ground. A beginning. The paper was worn thin, edges curled and smudged by tiny, trembling fingers. Ezra unfolded it carefully, smoothing it flat on the rough table beside the fire. The ink had bled in places, but the words still held. They were written in a tidy feminine hand, slanted and deliberate, as though each sentence had been laid down with careful breath. Lily sat nearby, her legs tucked under her, sketching with charcoal on scraps of birch bark, while Ezra read the page over and over. "He says the land was never mine, but Mama gave it to me. There's a deed hidden in the barn's east wall, under the second floorboard by the beam. If anything happens, I pray someone finds it. He drinks more now. He talks of selling me. I fear he means it." There was no name signed at the bottom, but Ezra didn't need one. The way Lily clung to the note, the way her voice cracked when she'd whispered, "Mama," he knew it belonged to Clara. Ezra remembered her then, years ago, before the fire and the silence. A young woman with auburn hair and bright eyes, full of light even when life gave her darkness. She'd passed through town just once, swollen with child, her husband, Jebediah, already drunk and loud behind her. Miriam had helped her deliver. Ezra had seen her from a distance, standing outside the old general store, rubbing her belly with a look both hopeful and afraid. Now she was somewhere in the dark, locked away by the same man, and her daughter, this small, brave soul, had crossed frozen woods to carry a single page to the only man in town who still remembered how to listen. Ezra folded the paper again and tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat. Across the room, Lily finished her drawing and held it up without a word. It was a rough but vivid picture. Crude lines for the mountains, a child's face peeking out from a window, and behind her, a house with a sloped red roof. The roof was the color of rusted tin. Ezra squinted at it. Something stirred in the back of his memory. That place, he murmured. He had seen it once, north of the hollow, before the road turned to swamp. Jebediah's place. Only back then, it hadn't looked so broken. The roof had gleamed in the sun like a copper penny. Ezra stood. He grabbed his coat and rifle, slinging both over his shoulder. "I need to talk to someone," he said to Lily. "An old friend of your mama's. You stay here. Lock the door. You remember how I showed you?" She nodded once solemnly. Then after a pause, she pointed to the drawing and tapped her chest. "She sings in the morning," she said softly, "even when he hurts her." Ezra swallowed hard and stepped out into the cold. He found Miriam at the edge of town. Her cottage hunched beneath a great willow tree whose leaves had long since fallen. Time had bent her spine and faded her eyes. But when she opened the door and saw Ezra, her mouth curled into a slow, knowing smile. "Well," she said, leaning on her cane, "didn't expect you before the thaw. You look like a man carrying more than his own weight." "I need to talk," Ezra said. "It's about Clara." At the sound of that name, Miriam's eyes sharpened. She stepped aside without another word. Inside, the fire burned low, but the stories waiting to rise were hot as ever. The kettle hissed softly as Miriam poured water over dried sage and mountain mint, her hands trembling slightly but sure in their memory. The old woman moved with the rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime tending to others, cradling newborns, stitching wounds, laying coins on the eyes of the dead. Her eyes, pale and milky with age, saw only shapes and shadows now, but her hearing was sharp, and her voice had not lost its edge. She sat across from Ezra at the worn kitchen table, her gnarled fingers wrapped around a steaming mug. "So," she said without ceremony, "Clara's girl made it out." Ezra nodded, barefoot, half-starved, clutching a torn page like it was the last piece of her mother. Miriam took a long sip. "And Jebediah? Still breathing?" Miriam gave a bitter little laugh and set her mug down. "That man was poisoned from the day he wandered into this valley. Clara was just 16. Her mother had just passed. Rest her. And the Crowley boy came around with a bottle of rye and a wagon full of promises. Took her from this town like a thief in the night. I delivered that baby, you know. She came back once, swollen and bruised, asking if there was any way to annul a name she'd signed under threat. I told her I couldn't change the law, only try to outlive the men who made it." Ezra's jaw tightened. "There's a deed," he said. "Clara's journal says it's under a floorboard in the barn." Miriam's eyes turned toward the window, though they saw nothing. That land never belonged to Jebediah. Clara's mama was given it for nursing soldiers after the war. A grant from the governor himself. Paper was real, stamped. I saw it once before she passed. She told me to keep it safe, but Clara insisted she'd guard it herself." Ezra leaned forward. "He's planning to sell her, downriver. Keep the girl if he finds her. Turn her into labor." Miriam didn't gasp. She only nodded, like sorrow had long ago replaced surprise. "He won't go down easy," she said. "Men like Jebediah don't believe they can lose. He's been king of that pit for too long. But if there's one thing I've learned," she said, tapping her cane against the floor, "it's that even the deepest roots rot when the soil turns against them." Ezra rose to leave, but Miriam reached out and caught his sleeve with surprising strength. "I want to see her," she said. He brought Lily the next morning. She clung to his coat like moss to bark, her wide eyes scanning every sound. When Miriam opened the door, Lily shrank back, But the midwife crouched down slow and patient, her wrinkled hand reaching for the child's. "You look just like her," she whispered. "Same fire in the eyes, same hush in your step." She wrapped a hand-woven shawl around Lily's shoulders, thick with age and lavender-scented wool. "There," she said, "a flame in the cold. Don't you go out." Lily leaned into her, not with words but with stillness, a trust offered without question. When Ezra turned to leave, Miriam didn't follow. She only spoke from her doorway, her voice quiet but unwavering. "It's time you stopped hiding, Ezra Blackwood. That girl needs more than your roof. She needs your courage. And so does this valley." Ezra didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence now carried purpose. He tipped his hat, lifted Lily back onto the mule, and rode into the rising wind. The ridge behind him stood quiet, but the man descending from it no longer carried only the weight of ghosts. The sky was still ink dark when Ezra stirred the embers and fastened the saddle on the mule. Frost lined the window panes like spider webs spun in silver. Lily stood quietly beside the door, already dressed in her thickest layers, the shawl from Miriam draped tight around her shoulders. She said nothing, but her eyes held a determination far older than her years. Ezra handed her a satchel with dried meat and a canteen, then crouched to meet her gaze. "You remember the path I showed you?" She nodded. "If I draw him off, you go straight to the vent. Don't wait. Don't stop. You find the beam and count 2 boards to the right. That's where she said it was. You come back the way you came, fast." Lily nodded again. She clutched her doll tighter, tucked it into the folds of the shawl, and mounted behind Ezra as he led the mule down the ridge trail, snow crunching beneath their boots. They reached the edge of the property just as dawn peeled back the sky, laying thin bands of pink across the low hills. The barn stood like a drunk sentinel, lopsided and weary from years of neglect. Smoke curled from the chimney of the house, but no dogs barked. No movement stirred in the upper windows. Ezra motioned Lily down and pointed to the side path leading toward the root cellar. She took off on silent feet, her breath misting in the cold. Ezra stepped into the open. He didn't have to wait long. A shape emerged from the shadows beside the barn. Broad-chested, thick-necked, eyes like mud and fists like anvils. Caleb Crowley, kin by blood, but beast by nature. He held a rusted shotgun, chewing a toothpick with a smug sort of slowness. "Well, well," Caleb drawled. "Didn't think the ghost would come knocking." Ezra didn't answer. He just took one deliberate step forward, eyes locked on the man's. Caleb raised the shotgun a few inches. "Don't try nothing, old man. You don't scare me." Ezra raised his hand slightly and kept moving, drawing Caleb's attention away from the barn. Inside, Lily had already reached the vent and wriggled through, scraping her knees on the frozen dirt. Her small fingers found the shelf she had knocked loose before. She ducked behind it and counted softly under her breath. 1, 2, until her hand touched the uneven wood of the hidden floorboard. Back outside, Caleb was getting agitated. Ezra had circled closer, talking now, asking questions about the livestock, the cold, anything to keep him distracted. But Caleb's eyes narrowed suddenly. "Where's the girl?" Inside, Lily pulled free a rusted metal box, covered in dust and spider silk. She cracked it open and found, wrapped in a strip of oilcloth, an old folded paper with a state seal and ribbon still barely visible. Beneath it, a photograph, faded but whole. Her mother stood beside a man with soft eyes, one arm around her waist, the other resting on her swollen belly. Clara had once been happy. A loud curse snapped the stillness. Caleb had seen movement. He turned toward the barn, and that's when Ezra struck. A swift blur of motion. His boot slammed into Caleb's knee, sending the man lurching sideways. The shotgun fired into the sky. Birds shrieked from the trees. Ezra landed 2 solid punches to Caleb's jaw and temple, and the bigger man crumpled into the snow with a grunt, unconscious before he hit the ground. Lily burst from the side of the barn, clutching the box tight against her chest. Ezra met her at the fence, scooped her up, and together they vanished into the woods as the wind picked up and the sun bled gold across the frost-bitten hills. Back at the cabin, Ezra opened the box again, studying the deed. It was real, valid, signed and witnessed. The land was Clara's by law in blood. The photo he handed to Lily, who traced her mother's smile with one small finger before holding it to her heart. They had what they came for. Now they'd have to fight to keep it. The sheriff's office sat squat on Main Street, pressed between the livery and the saloon like a stone no one bothered to move. Its windows were fogged from years of pipe smoke and indifference, and its door stuck in the winter cold. Ezra pushed it open with a slow creak and stepped inside. The box tucked under one arm like a soldier bearing a folded flag. The room smelled of tobacco, old coffee, and something sourer, compromise left to rot. Sheriff Abel Bartle sat behind the desk, feet up, hat tipped low, sipping from a chipped mug. He glanced up when he saw Ezra and let out a soft, humorless grunt. "Well now, ain't that something? Thought you were just a ghost these days, Blackwood." Ezra didn't respond. He stepped forward, placed the deed on the sheriff's desk, and opened the oilcloth just enough to show the embossed seal. The photograph remained inside the box, safe. "That's Clara Crowley's deed," Ezra said, voice steady. "Signed and witnessed. Her mama's land, not Jebediah's. He's holding her prisoner, beating her, trying to sell her off like livestock. I brought the proof. It's time you did your job." Bartle leaned forward, squinting at the paper, then leaned back with a sigh. He scratched his cheek, took another sip of coffee, and shook his head. "Now, Ezra, this here's a complicated situation. It's a family matter. Marriage makes things muddy. If she's still legally wed, the property might be under his claim. And you know how these things go. No judge gonna rule on words scribbled in a lady's diary." "I didn't say nothing about her journal," Ezra said, eyes narrowing. Bartle's hand froze on the mug. The room went still. "Besides," the sheriff continued, shifting in his chair, "even if this was ironclad, riding onto a man's land, busting heads and sneaking into barns with a child, you're asking for trouble. That ain't law. That's vigilante nonsense. Jebediah's no saint, I'll admit, but he keeps the saloon stocked, sends my office 2 crates of rye every harvest. Town don't need a mess right now." "Not with winter coming." Ezra stared at him, long and cold. "You telling me you're trading a woman's life for whiskey?" Bartle didn't answer. He only set his cup down and stood slowly, stepping close enough for Ezra to smell the liquor on his breath. "I'm telling you this," he said low. "You ride any closer to that farm again, and I'll be obliged to put you in a cell. You let this go. Walk away while you still can." Ezra stared a moment longer, then leaned forward, spat a long rope of tobacco-stained disgust onto the floor, and turned on his heel. Outside, the morning wind caught the brim of his hat. The town had started to stir. Curtains twitched, doors creaked. A few shopkeepers stood stiff behind their counters, pretending not to look. By midday, whispers spread like wildfire. The bear of the ridge had come to town with a child in tow and a fire in his eyes. Said he had proof of wrongdoing. Said the sheriff turned him away. Some folks laughed, called him broken, said he was chasing ghosts again. But others, especially those who remembered Clara, who remembered her kind smile and sudden disappearance, began to ask questions. What kind of man rides out of exile for a girl that ain't his blood? What kind of man dares to defy the sheriff and the law of silence that had ruled Warm Springs for too long? The answers hadn't yet taken root, but the soil was shifting. One child had knocked, one man had answered. And the town, whether it liked it or not, was beginning to wake. The barn was colder than it should have been, the wind pushing through cracks in the boards like fingers searching for secrets. Jebediah Crowley stormed through the open doors, boots stomping hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. A foul scent clung to him, sweat, liquor, and smoke. He shoved aside crates and kicked over a rusted milk pail, cursing with every breath. His eyes burned red as he fell to his knees beside the spot near the beam, second floorboard to the right, where the box had been hidden. Gone. He ripped up the floorboard with his bare hands, splinters cutting deep into his calloused fingers, blood smearing the edge like war paint. He stared down into the empty cavity, chest heaving. Then he roared, a sound that echoed out across the fields, loud enough to startle crows into flight. The journal, too, was missing. He'd looked for it after he found the cellar door unlocked, the vent open. He hadn't believed the girl had made it far. He thought she'd died in the cold like a whelp too weak to howl. But now he knew better. She'd found someone. She'd told. Clara was still in the cellar, her face lit only by the faint glow of daylight, bleeding through a crack in the planks. She heard the door crash open before he spoke. She had time only to stand before Jebediah descended the stairs like a storm breaking loose. "You think you're clever?" he growled. "You think you can run your mouth, send your brat off with lies?" She didn't answer. She stood tall, though her knees trembled beneath her dress. He struck her across the face. Once, then again. Her lips split, and she staggered, but she didn't fall. That only made him angrier. He grabbed a length of chain from the wall, wrapped it around her wrists, and hooked it to the old meat loop overhead. "You want to be a martyr, Clara? Fine. I'll sell you as one. They'll chain you up worse than I ever did. You'll be lucky if they let you keep your teeth." Upstairs, he slammed the cellar door shut and slid the bolt, breathing heavy. Then he reached for his coat and staggered into town, straight to the post-rider's shack. He shoved a few silver coins into the man's hand and hissed his instructions through clenched teeth. Word would spread downriver before nightfall. The kind of men who didn't ask questions would come sniffing soon. He pinned a crude note to the saloon wall. Bounty, $100. Ezra Blackwood. Bring him in, breathing or not. Back on the ridge, the air hung still. Ezra sat near the fire, sharpening a hunting knife that hadn't tasted use in over a decade. Lily sat cross-legged beside him, a piece of charcoal in her hand, drawing on the back of a flour sack. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, careful, but no longer afraid. "He used to scream at her when she sang," she said. "Said her voice was a curse. But Mama kept singing. Even when he hit her, she sang in the dark. For me." Ezra didn't speak. His hand slowed. The knife gleamed orange in the firelight. "She said if I ever got out, I should find someone brave, someone good." Ezra's throat tightened. He looked at the rifle mounted above the hearth, oiled, untouched, and resting like a relic of a man he thought he'd buried. He stood, reached up, and took it down. The weight was familiar, heavy with memory. He ran a cloth over the barrel, then checked the chamber. Lily looked up. "Are you going to help her?" Ezra didn't flinch. He just nodded once, solemn as a judge. "I aim to," he said. Outside, the wind shifted, curling down the ridge with a hiss like breath before a fight. The mountain man, long silent, was waking, and the reckoning was coming fast. The clearing behind Ezra's cabin was ringed with stones, flat, weathered things he'd hauled one by one from the riverbed years ago, when his back was younger and his heart still broken wide open. It had sat unused ever since. But now, with the sun sinking low behind the pines and the chill creeping back in, Ezra placed the last log on the fire circle like a man preparing for something sacred. Lily stood nearby, watching in silence. She hadn't asked what the stones were for. She simply waited, hands tucked into the sleeves of her shawl, eyes wide with curiosity that had finally begun to rise through the cracks in her fear. Ezra struck the flint and caught the kindling with practiced ease. Flames licked up through pine needles and dry bark, casting gold and copper across the snow-packed ground. He handed Lily a small blade, not sharp enough to cut, but good enough to learn. "Take the bark off slow," he said, holding up a stick. "Always carve away from your hand. Let the blade do the work." She mimicked his motion, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Ezra corrected her grip once, gently, then let her be. The fire popped and crackled as the stars blinked into view overhead. They worked side by side without talking, two silhouettes lit by flicker and flame. After a time, he laid his knife down. "When I was your age," he said, "I used to whittle little birds, hawks mostly. My pa said I had the hands of a carver, not a fighter. Told me to follow the quiet path. I didn't listen." Lily glanced up at him, her stick half sharpened. Ezra stared into the flames. "My daughter's name was Hannah. She had hair the color of wheat in August and a laugh that shook the rafters. Used to run through these woods barefoot. Called herself Queen of the Ridge." He paused, swallowed. "She loved sunflowers. Grew 'em behind the cabin every spring. Said they looked like the sun was smiling back." His voice broke then, like bark splitting under frost. He pressed a hand to his face, rubbing the grief like it was something he could scrub off. But it wouldn't go. It had never gone. She was 8. Fire took her. Took her mama, too. Town said it was an accident. But I know who lit that torch. And I've been up here ever since, keeping quiet. Letting the fire burn inside instead." There was a long silence. Then Lily moved beside him and wrapped her arms around his middle, pressing her cheek to his side. She said nothing, just held him, small and steady. Ezra didn't move for a long time. When he finally placed a hand on her back, it shook. The fire burned down to embers. The cold returned, but they stayed until the stars had multiplied and the moon rode high above the ridge. The next morning, Ezra opened his cabin door and stopped short. There on the step sat a tiny carved sunflower, rough and uneven but unmistakable. The petals were too thick, the stem crooked, but the love in it was pure. Lily had made it sometime before sunrise, using the little blade in the quiet hours. Ezra bent to pick it up, cradled it in his hand, and stared at it like it was the first thing he'd ever seen. Then he went to the back wall, opened an old chest, and pulled out his carving tools, dry with dust but still sharp. He lit the stove, sat at the table, and reached for a block of cedar. For the first time in 15 years, his hands moved with purpose, not to kill, not to survive, to create, to begin again. The church bell rang slower than usual that Sunday, its heavy tone rolling out over warm springs like a weary sigh. Inside, the wooden pews were half filled, more than most expected, less than what was needed. The congregation sat still, wool coats pulled tight, eyes cast downward as if the morning scripture might excuse their silence. Then the doors creaked open, and Miriam Boone stepped through, cane tapping against the floorboards like a clock counting down. She hadn't spoken in church in over a year, not since her legs had begun to fail her and her eyes dimmed with age. But now she walked straight to the pulpit without invitation, her spine straighter than usual, her voice steady when it came. "We've got a sickness in this town," she said, not bothering with preamble. "And it ain't just in one house or one man. It's in the quiet, in the looking away, in the comfort we keep while others are chained in cellars." A murmur rippled through the pews. Some stiffened, others listened. "You all remember Clara," Miriam went on, "before she was Clara Crowley. She helped at the general store, tended the graves with me when her mama passed. She was sweet but strong. She married too young, too poor. And she vanished without a trace while we all went on pretending we didn't see the bruises." She paused, letting the weight settle. "But someone did see. A little girl, Clara's own. She came down the mountain barefoot, carrying a page and a prayer. And Ezra Blackwood, The man we've all written off took her in, fed her, listened, fought for her when no one else would. The silence deepened. If that doesn't shame us, then we ain't got any soul left to save. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Inside, something shifted. Later that day, a quiet current began to move through town. Old Silas Merton, the blacksmith with hands like iron and a voice like thunder, hammered out a fresh horseshoe and wrapped it in burlap. He brought it to Ezra's door with no words, just a nod and a long look that said, "I see you now." Miss Abigail Tate, the school teacher with gray streaks in her braid, came next. She brought two children's books from her private shelf, the spines worn soft from years of quiet reading. "For Lily," she said. "She might not read 'em yet, but she'll feel the pages like they're friends." Others followed. Widow Crenshaw left a jar of blackberry preserves on the porch. The stable hand, Roy, dropped off a sack of oats and some clean linens. Nobody said much. They didn't have to. Actions were louder now. Back in town, the whispers changed tune. Where once they'd said, "Ezra's gone mad," they now asked, "Could we have been wrong?" The recluse with ash in his beard and grief in his eyes was no longer just a shadow on the ridge. He was a man who'd stepped forward when others had stepped aside. And at the heart of it all was the girl, small, quiet Lily, who had found her voice by drawing foxes and sunflowers on scraps of bark. The girl who never cried, even when the snow bit through her clothes. The child who reminded grown folks what it meant to be brave. In the still corners of Warm Springs, a new kind of story was beginning to take root. Not loud, not fast, but true. A story of the good, gathering. The trail to the county seat wound like a scar through the mountains, narrow and exposed, flanked by cliffs on one side and forested drop on the other. Ezra rode in silence. Lily nestled in front of him on the saddle, clutching the metal deed box wrapped in wool. The morning sun hadn't yet burned the frost from the trees, and steam rose from the mule's breath with every slow step. Ezra's eyes stayed sharp, scanning every bend in the trail. Something about the air felt wrong, too still, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. They'd barely rounded the third switchback when the first shot rang out. The mule shrieked, reared, and Ezra dove, shielding Lily as they tumbled into the underbrush. The bullet tore through the pack strapped behind him, splitting it open like paper. Another shot cracked through the trees. Bark exploded from the trunk beside them. "Down!" Ezra hissed, grabbing Lily's hand and pulling her low. They scrambled through the briars, mud clinging to their boots, until Ezra spotted the hollowed trunk of a fallen pine. He shoved the deed box into Lily's arms and pressed her gently inside. "Stay here. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Her eyes were wide, but she nodded. Ezra looked at her once more, then turned and vanished into the trees, rifle in hand, knife tucked in his belt. The men came fast, 3 of them, rough and dust-worn, sent by Jebediah and drawn by the promise of coin. They shouted through the trees, flanking wide, assuming Ezra was running scared. But he wasn't running. He was waiting. He caught the first one near a mossy ravine, a tall man with a scar over his brow. Ezra dropped from the rocks above like a thunderclap, knocking the rifle from his hands and slamming his elbow into the man's throat. The body hit the ground with a hollow thud. The second one found Ezra's bullet instead, a clean shot through the shoulder, enough to send him screaming back into the brush. The third man, younger and nervous, managed to fire a wild shot that caught Ezra high in the side, just beneath the ribs. He staggered, breath punched from his lungs, but he pressed forward, tackling the attacker into a stand of saplings. They crashed hard. Ezra's vision swam, but his knife was quicker than the man's boots. When it was done, the woods were quiet again, save for the distant caw of a hawk circling overhead. Ezra stumbled back through the brush, one hand pressed to his side, crimson soaking through his shirt. He found the hollow tree and collapsed beside it. Lily peeked out, saw the blood, and crawled to him without hesitation. "You hurt," she said, voice shaking. "I'm all right," he rasped. But the lie didn't hold. She knelt beside him, cradled his face with her small hands. "Don't leave me." "I won't," he whispered, tears blurring his sight. "I promise." She leaned close, her voice steadier now. "You're my papa now." Ezra broke then, not from pain, but from the weight of it all, from the years of silence, the grief buried so deep it had nearly turned to stone. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Blood and dirt forgotten in the warmth of her embrace. For the first time in years, Ezra Blackwood wept not for what he had lost, but for what he had found. The news arrived before the dust had settled on the ridge. By midday, the whispers galloped faster than any horse, reaching every corner of Warm Springs. Ezra Blackwood had been ambushed on the trail to the county seat. Blood had been spilled. Some said he killed 3 men. Others said he'd gone mad, dragging a child into gunfire over a woman who wasn't his. The facts warped like smoke, each retelling, bending the truth further. By sundown, the mayor called for Ezra's arrest. Mayor Withers stood on the steps of the town hall, face pink with anger, sweat darkening the collar of his fine coat. "This mountain man," he bellowed to the crowd, "has brought danger to our doorsteps. He's taken the law into his own hands, putting a little girl at risk. This town cannot abide chaos masquerading as heroism. I want Blackwood brought in, alive if possible." The crowd murmured, uncertain. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked at their feet. Inside her cottage, Miriam Boone sat with Clara's journal open on her lap, her thin fingers tracing the page like it was holy scripture. When she heard the mayor's words echo through the town, she rose, lit a lantern, and made her way to the church. She didn't wait for permission. She stood beneath the wooden cross and called out to anyone within earshot. "If the law won't speak truth," she said, voice sharp as a flint strike, "then I will." Curious and uneasy, townsfolk began to gather. Widows in shawls, ranch hands with dust still on their boots, shopkeepers with aprons stained from the day's work. The church bell rang, not in mourning, but in defiance. Miriam held up the journal. "This is Clara Crowley's hand," she said. "These are her words, and they are not easy to hear." She began to read, her voice cracking in places but never faltering. She read about the beatings, about the cellar, about the times Clara went days without food so Lily could eat. She read about the bruises she painted over with soot, the silent prayers she whispered in the dark, the page where she wrote, "If anything happens, I pray someone finds this and believes me." The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon. "She was just a girl," Miriam said, her voice now a whisper, "and she asked us to believe her." A rancher near the front took off his hat. "And we didn't," he muttered. "No," Miriam replied, "but Ezra did. And that child, she crossed the woods with nothing but hope. While we sat warm in our homes and shut our eyes, a young school teacher stepped forward. What if we're the ones who should be on trial, not him?" Someone else called out, "Where's the sheriff?" Sheriff Bartle emerged from the shadows near the chapel steps. His eyes were hollow, as though the weight of his years had finally caught up to him. He looked out at the crowd, no longer silent, no longer blind. "I heard the same words she just read," he said quietly. "Long before today, I chose not to act. That was my sin." "Then fix it," Miriam said. He straightened. "Then hear this. There will be no arrest made. Not today. Not of Ezra Blackwood." A murmur of relief rippled through the gathering. The tide had turned. What had started as a whisper in the cold had become something stronger. The town, once silent, had begun to speak. And in its voice there stirred the first true winds of justice. The wind had a strange weight to it that morning, thick, charged, laced with the scent of iron and pine. Clouds churned low over the ridge like a warning, thunder grumbling just beyond the horizon. Ezra rode at the head of the small procession, his rifle strapped to his back, his jaw set in stone. Beside him, Miriam sat upright in a wagon pulled by the blacksmith's gelding, her cane clutched tight and her eyes sharp with purpose. Behind them came others, ranch hands, the school teacher, Widow Crenshaw, even young Roy from the stables, carrying nothing but a length of rope and a fire in his gut. They reached the Crowley homestead just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The house stood crooked and quiet, its windows dark, the barn door ajar like a mouth frozen mid-curse. No sign of Caleb, no hired guns waiting in ambush, just the stink of fear and rot clinging to the porch. Ezra didn't wait for an invitation. He dismounted and kicked in the front door with one brutal crack. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and stale liquor. The walls bore holes and stains. The floor creaked with every step like it ached beneath years of cruelty. He moved through the rooms like a storm in flesh, each breath steady, each movement sure. At the rear of the house, he found the cellar door. The bolt had rusted but held firm, until Miriam's cane cracked down on it with surprising strength. It snapped loose. Ezra flung the door open and descended into the darkness. It smelled of mildew and blood. Clara hung from a meat hook, arms bound in chains, her face pale and battered. But her eyes were open. She blinked when she saw him, as though unsure whether he was real or part of a dream long abandoned. "Clara," he said softly, and that broke her. A sob cracked through her lips. He crossed the room and took her weight as gently as he could while unhooking the chain. She sagged against him, barely conscious, her body trembling. He lifted her into his arms. Behind him, the cellar stairs groaned. Jebediah stood at the top, a pistol aimed down, rage boiling behind his eyes. His shirt was half-buttoned, his boots mismatched. But the menace in him was clear and real. "You think you can take what's mine?" he snarled. "That woman is my wife. That land is mine. You don't get to decide what's just." Ezra said nothing. He simply turned his body to shield Clara as best he could. The shot never came. A crack rang out, louder than thunder, and Jebediah's pistol spun from his hand, clattering down the stairs. Smoke curled from the chapel pistol in Reverend Josiah McKinnon's grip, held steady from the top of the path. "You forgot," the preacher called. "She was God's before she was ever yours." Jebediah clutched his hand, howling in rage. But the town had come with rope and purpose. Silas the blacksmith stepped forward and seized him by the collar. The others closed in behind, no longer afraid, no longer willing to turn away. Ezra carried Clara out into the storm. Rain mixed with blood and mud, washing the world clean one drop at a time. Lily ran to them, barefoot again, but strong and sure. She threw her arms around her mother's waist, and Clara dropped to her knees and held her like a lifeline. Ezra stood above them, eyes lifted to the sky. The chains were broken. The house of pain had fallen. And for the first time in years, the air smelled like freedom. The canyon walls rose like sentinels around the gathered crowd, their red stone faces carved by wind and time, now witness to a reckoning long overdue. A wide, flat ledge near the base had been cleared of brush and laid with planks, forming a crude dais where a traveling judge, Honorable Silas Keene, sat beneath a canvas awning, his robes dust-stained, but his eyes sharp as ever. He had presided over murderers and land thieves in his day, but as he scanned the crowd, ranchers, school teachers, blacksmiths, and farmhands, he knew this was not an ordinary trial. Ezra stood silent at Clara's side, his wounds still healing beneath his coat. Clara sat upright in a borrowed chair, her face lined with bruises but proud, unbowed. Beside her, Lily held tight to her hand, eyes darting from one face to the next with quiet intensity. Jebediah Crowley stood with his wrists bound, flanked by two deputies brought in from the next county. His scowl was more bruised than his pride, but he still carried himself like a man used to getting away with things. He spat once in the dirt and glared toward the dais. Judge Keene raised his voice, firm and formal. We are gathered here in the open light because justice should not hide in shadows. The matter before us is not only a legal dispute, but a question of conscience. Speak your truths now, for they will be weighed. Miriam was the first to take the stand. Her voice, though raspy, carried through the canyon like scripture. She read aloud from Clara's journal, pausing only when her hands trembled too badly to hold the pages still. She spoke of nights spent treating Clara's bruises, of warnings unheeded and pleas unanswered. Next came Silas Merton, the blacksmith, who spoke of the bounty pinned in the saloon and the rumors whispered by drifters sent downriver. Then Abigail Tate stepped forward with Lily's drawings, one of the cellar door, one of her mother singing, one of the man with the red hands. She held them up with quiet courage, her voice shaking as she explained what the pictures meant. Jebediah scoffed when his turn came. I took in a wild woman and tried to make her decent, he growled. That land ain't hers. It was never hers. She's sick in the head, and that girl's just been filled with lies. That mountain man twisted it all. Judge Keene leaned forward. And how do you explain the deed recovered from your barn? Signed, sealed, and registered to Clara's mother? Jebediah's face reddened, his mouth opened, but no words came. And how, the judge continued, voice rising, do you explain the chains found in your cellar? The bruises? The child's escape? Jebediah looked around but saw no allies. Just silence. Just the eyes of a town that had finally stopped looking away. Judge Keene stood. This court recognizes the deed as valid and binding. The land belongs to Clara Crowley by right of inheritance. Furthermore, given the accounts of abuse, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit trafficking, this court sentences Jebediah Crowley to 15 years hard labor in the state mines without parole. There was a beat of stillness. Then the crowd erupted. Cheers echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the walls like thunder. Hats flew into the air. Miriam wept openly. Silas raised a fist. Ezra simply lowered his head, a single breath escaping him like a stone being set down after years of carrying. Clara turned to Lily, gathering her in her arms, tears slipping down her cheeks. Lily clung to her mother, pressing her face into the crook of her neck, whispering something only Clara could hear. And above them all, the sky broke open with sunlight. No clouds, no storm. Just light at last. The old farmhouse stood crooked and weary, its boards sun-bleached and scarred from years of neglect. But where rot once ruled and silence hung thick as fog, now came the hammer's rhythm and the laughter of neighbors. Ezra stood on the front steps with a hatchet in hand, shaping a new beam for the porch. Clara was inside, sweeping the soot and spider webs from corners that hadn't seen care in a decade. Lily chased chickens through the tall grass, her doll now tied to her back like a sister instead of a burden. Each morning the sun rose a little warmer, and with it came townsfolk bearing gifts not wrapped in paper, but in kindness. Silas the blacksmith delivered nails and a bell he forged himself. Small, bronze, and hung from a cedar bracket just above the door. So you can call folks to supper, he said with a wink. He stayed for coffee, rolled his sleeves, and helped reset the broken fence. Miss Tate arrived with books tucked beneath her arm, simple stories with big letters and bright illustrations. She sat with Lily beneath a shade tree and began to teach her how letters sounded, how they danced into words, and how those words could live forever. Lily soaked it up like rain after drought, her lips moving in silent practice even as she walked back to the house. Miriam came too, cane tapping against the earth, bringing bundles of herbs, cuttings of lavender, and a single sunflower she had raised in a clay pot. For the port, she said, so it always faces the light. Ezra worked from dawn to dusk, replacing window frames, carving new stair rails, and reinforcing the barn with hands that had once only known how to destroy. But now those same hands built, steady and sure, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. He never said it aloud, but the way he smoothed every floorboard and wiped sweat from his brow before measuring twice spoke of a man who no longer drifted. He built a porch swing one afternoon, his blades shaping each curve with patient precision. When it was done, he rubbed it down with oil and set it to hang on thick chains, perfectly balanced. That evening, Lily climbed into it with her doll and kicked off softly, the creak of the chains marking time like an old lullaby. Ezra watched her from the steps, the weight in his chest easing by degrees. One morning, Clara came out with 2 tin cups of coffee, her braid falling over one shoulder, her steps slow but sure. She sat beside him on the porch rail, their arms brushing but not clinging. "You don't have to leave," she said, her voice soft and carried on the breeze. "Not now." Ezra looked out at the valley, the hills stretching green and gold beneath a sky scrubbed clean by spring. He didn't speak, just took the cup, sipped, and nodded once. He stayed. The days stretched long and warm, with spring blooming into early summer like a blessing that wouldn't stop giving. The land, once tired and heavy with sorrow, now sang with color. Wildflowers dotted the hillside. Bees hummed near the window panes, and laughter, real and full, spilled from the farmhouse porch as easily as sunlight. Lily had taken to drawing everything she saw: the barn, the mule, the wild fox who sometimes returned to watch her from the tree line. She filled pages with her mother's face, the ridge, and Ezra sitting in his chair, pipe clenched but never lit, eyes squinting in amusement. Her fingers were always stained with charcoal, and her lips curled in concentration. She could now read simple words too, taught by Miss Tate, who came every Wednesday to teach and stayed for pie and news. Clara had begun baking again. It started with biscuits, uneven and a little burnt, but quickly returned to the buttery rolls and sweet cornbread she'd once been known for in town. The scent of cinnamon and fresh dough drifted through the windows, luring Ezra from his carving bench more than once. She sang while she worked, softly under her breath, but always with a steady rhythm, like a heart mended and still beating. Ezra smiled more, not wide or often, but deep and true when it came. He still rose early, still chopped wood like it was a language he understood best, but there was something easier in his shoulders now. He carved toys for Lily, small animals, a family of bears, even a replica of her doll. He built a bookshelf for her growing collection and a small bench beneath the window where she could sit and dream. When the new schoolhouse was completed, the whole town turned out. It stood near the chapel, whitewashed and proud, with a copper bell that shone bright under the noon sun. Children ran barefoot across the field. Mothers laid out blankets, and music played from a fiddle tuned just that morning. Preacher Josiah stood before the crowd, his Bible tucked beneath one arm, his other hand resting gently on Lily's shoulder. She wore a yellow ribbon in her hair and clutched a small drawing of the schoolhouse in her free hand. "This building is more than wood and paint," Josiah said. "It's a promise that we will no longer turn our backs on suffering, that we will see and listen, that we will choose courage over comfort. We were once a town divided by silence. Now we are gathered by truth." Miriam stood beside Lily, holding her hand. Tears shimmered in her faded eyes, but her grip was firm. Around them stood the townsfolk, once indifferent, now loyal, now brave. They cheered, not just for the school, but for what it stood for. Ezra watched from the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, heart full. Clara stood beside him, fingers brushing his. She didn't have to say a word. Neither did he. They weren't bound by blood, but by something stronger. They were a family, and they were whole. Spring returned like a hymn whispered back by the earth itself, as though the valley had been holding its breath all winter just to sing and bloom. The hills rolled in green velvet, stitched with wildflowers that danced under the breeze. Creeks ran clear again, fed by melted snow, and the sky, once so often gray and watching, had turned a wide and faithful blue. On a small hill just above the farmhouse, a patch of sunflowers stood tall and golden, their faces turned skyward as if in prayer. They hadn't been there last spring. Lily had planted them herself, each seed pressed into soil with tiny hands and great care. She called them Hannah's Smile, saying her papa's little girl should always have sunshine, even when the clouds came. Ezra knelt among the stalks now, his hand gently brushing one of the wide yellow faces. The petals trembled slightly at his touch, soft and warm. His eyes didn't glisten, but they held a stillness that carried weight, like memory, like gratitude, like a wound finally closed without vanishing. Behind him, the soft crunch of footsteps approached, and Clara came to his side. She didn't speak. She just placed a hand on his shoulder and stood beside him, letting the breeze wrap them in silence. She wore her hair loose that day and the light caught the red in it. She looked stronger now, leaner from work, yes, but with a spirit restored. Beside her, Ezra no longer looked like a man hiding from the world, but a man who had returned to it and found something worth staying for. Below the hill, the fields were alive with laughter. The town had gathered for the annual spring picnic, a tradition that had returned after years of silence. Blankets lay scattered across the grass, baskets spilled over with bread and sweet preserves, and children raced between the legs of grinning fathers. The new school teacher read aloud beneath a tree, and Miriam held court on a rocking chair someone had hauled from the church, surrounded by people asking for remedies and advice. Lily darted from group to group, her hair in ribbons, her cheeks pink from play. She wore a necklace made of twine and carved wooden beads, Ezra's handiwork gifted just that morning. Her laugh cut through the air like birdsong, pure and clear. She stopped only once to glance up at the hill where Ezra knelt. When she saw him there, she waved. He raised a hand in return. There was a time not long ago when this place had felt cursed, poisoned by fear and silence, when its people looked away and called it peace. But now, beneath skies once thick with storm, life bloomed. Forgiveness had taken root, and courage, planted by a child's small feet, had grown tall. Ezra stood and helped Clara to her feet. Together they walked down the hill toward their home, toward their people, toward a future that no longer whispered loss but sang with promise. In time they'd tell stories of the mountain man of warm springs, how he once vanished into the trees, carrying only grief, and how he returned with something better than vengeance. He returned with heart. They'd say he faced down evil not with fire, but with steadfast hands and the love of a child. They'd say that when the valley was darkest, he brought the sunflowers back.